Well, thanks to Jan for inviting me. Fortunately, the news hasn't yet reached New York that the UK is only just in Europe and only for the next couple of years, probably. But we have been set for this session a frightening examination question. On the sheet there are 7 questions, all more or less impossible. Luckily, we have Arnoud Boot and Sean Safford. I'm sure they are people who have never failed an exam in their lives, so they will lead us off. It seems to me there are 4 sets of issues embedded in this session. One on industrial policy, that we might think about what that means. I think Arnaud's got something to say about that. Another on labour markets, and I know Sean's going to talk about that. Another set on the size of the state, which we've already touched on, and another on the impact of government on financial markets, and particularly on efficiency and capital allocation. Just a few brief introductory remarks from me. I've wrestled with these issues for nearly 40 years, mainly as a practitioner, not an academic. Way back in the late 70s, 1977, I drafted a white paper on nationalised industry policy under the then Labour government, and also a white paper on industrial democracy. Both of them were complete failures. I was the banking regulator for 8 years, from 95 to 03. I always emphasised that date because things started to go wrong around the end of that year. And now I'm, amongst other things, as well as teaching here, chairing the Airports Commission, looking at the location of UK airport infrastructure, which is a whole other can of worms. But on these issues, I would say that in the UK, a kind of Thatcher-Blair consensus on industrial policy and labour markets continues to reign. Thatcher, of course, dead, and Blair, not a person who can be seen in polite company outside the US. But the view that active industrial policy is doomed to failure prevails, and that's not just about not picking winners, but indeed even extends to the provision of crucial parts of the infrastructure. So on airports, for example, my brief is that any solution I come up with must be financed by the private sector. The government merely is limited to a planning role and maybe a little bit of public transport linkage. Only Boris Johnson, our Mayor of London, a strange populist demagogue with no tax-raising responsibilities, thinks the government should take the lead and do something about it itself. As an aside, it's not a coincidence that we are a country, therefore, which has the most efficient airports in Europe in the sense of utilisation of capacity by a long way, but we have never built another runway since 1945. The last runway in the UK, in the southeast, was built by the US Air Force. On the labour market, we have no inclination to re-regulate labour markets. The EU social chapter is not welcomed by any party in the UK, though there is a strong domestic agenda on equality issues, which are not seen as hostile to employment. The Thatcher-Blair consensus on the labour market has been reinforced by behaviour and unemployment in the UK in the crisis and after. It doesn't rise as much as elsewhere and has fallen quite sharply. We now have an unemployment rate of 6.2% versus the European average of 11.5%. This is not all good. There are a lot of dissuaded workers. There's a lot of inequality, and that's been growing in terms of pay distribution. Low pay is a significant issue for the Labour Party, but does not appear to be particularly salient for the electorate. On the size of the state, there is a broad consensus in favour of a smaller state, in spite of much evidence that it's not the size of the state that matters, but the efficiency and effectiveness of public investment. However, in the UK, we are fundamentally pessimistic about the state's ability to spend money wisely. So UK nationalised industries were, when they existed, far less efficient than French nationalised industries. Politicians wouldn't leave them alone. So now water and electricity and refuse collection has been, quotes, privatised, unquotes, which means I pay my bills in London to EDF and Veolia. And German railways run part of our rail network. No one minds at all as long as the trains run on time. There is a minor swing of the pendulum in that area, in that the rail network is in effect being kind of renationalised, but that really only means track maintenance. In the financial sector, there has been a change of approach. There is a broad support for higher capital ratios and support for bank lending to SMEs, But that is really not about trying to increase efficiency and allocating capital. Indeed, underwriting SME loans works rather in the opposite direction. Furthermore, I think we're going in precisely the opposite direction of the one advocated by Bastian, where he talked about the need for a smaller number rationalization of banks in Europe. We are moving precisely in the opposite direction to try to create more banks, actually, to have new challenger banks and more competition in bank lending. So once again, I think the UK is swimming in completely the opposite direction. I apologize for the slightly pessimistic, you may say nihilistic tone of these opening remarks. At the height of the crisis in the UK, there was more interest in active government policies to rebalance the economy away from an excessive reliance on finance, but few concrete ideas emerged from this, except to protect relative expenditure on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths research and teaching in universities, and to reduce support for any other subjects. So industrial policy in the UK resolved itself into starving economists of funds. My concern, I have to say, in listening to the debate, is that there is a risk to me in Europe that a problem which is, to me, one of monetary, fiscal, and political design, in other words, an inflexible framework, which I hear many people think is in need of change, that because that is impossible to change, you then start to do something else. And I worry about industrial policy as a kind of diversion tactic, and infrastructure investment as a diversion tactic, because you can't solve the core problem, so you've got to do something. And indeed, if one was uncharitable in interpreting Michel Sapin's speech last night, that was what it was. Yes, we'd love to change the rules. Yes, we'd love to change the monetary approach. But since we can't, let's spend some money, for God's sake, on something. And that doesn't strike me as being necessarily the right way to get an effective industrial policy. But I'm sure that Arnoud and Sean will have some more concrete and more positive ideas. Arnoud is going to speak next, Professor of Corporate Finance and Financial Markets at Amsterdam, who's written extensively and interestingly on financial regulation, I know, and other subjects too, then followed by Sean, who's director of the MPA program here. Arnoud.
Thanks very much, Howard. Let me start with the following comment. I would like to get away from, and it's also in a sense embedded in your last comment about, I want to get away from the element of trust and distrust. And I think your remark was precisely to the point that the distrust in general can lead to suggestions that we are trying to spend money on industrial policy in order to show that we have something European. And in the end, people start questioning this, and we have not come up with something, we have not come up with an improvement, but rather we have digged a deeper hole. I would like to approach it from the level of that there is a need. There is a need in Europe, as emphasized by many, to collaborate. There is a need in Europe to strengthen, say, the internal market. And actually, if you talk about industrial policy, you end up at levels of definition. Where do policies promoting the internal market begin and end, and where does industrial policy begin or end? I take a very, I think, non-controversial, in the meantime, perspective on industrial policy. Industrial policy is not about picking winners. Industrial policy is about resolving coordination failure, having a better dialogue between government and business, understanding each other better, with a clear marcation of each other's role. In the Netherlands, I have been criticizing this to some extent, but in the Netherlands we have come up with a new type of industrial policy. A new type of industrial policy is not really new. It's basically in line with what Danny Roderick has been writing about for years. It is that this dialogue between business and government is important. Government can play a role in resolving coordination failures, and a better information exchange in any case would help. But it requires credible institutions. It requires a Ministry of Economic Affairs where the people know that it will not be captured by industry and will not be captured by vested interest. Because in the end, industrial policy, if you think about coordination failure, it's rather about accomplishing something new than being captured by the existing vested interest. So industrial policy in the Netherlands, the most modern variation on it, after we have, in Churchill's tradition, made every possible mistake before that, by trying to rescue the textile industry, trying to rescue the shipping industry over the last 50 years, is basically we have created some round tables, basically organized by the Ministry of Economic Affairs, organized round tables in different sectors of the economy in order to improve the communication between the Ministry of Economic Affairs that actually in the 70s, 80s had lost contact with the business sector. In the socialist years of the Netherlands has lost contact with the business sector and basically had re-established the contact with the business sector. So in that much more narrow frame, I would like to look at industrial policy. And one should translate it, and that's the question here, to the European level. Let's be very careful that we are not going to introduce new frictions. New frictions in the sense that basically undermine the changing narrative that André was proposing. I think narratives can only be created by having constructive actions, constructive success, and basically you make the narrative around the constructive success that you have rather than come up with a narrative out of the blue. And the narrative out of the blue, obviously Europe has done this. The Lisbon Treaty talked about that we would be the most competitive region in the world in 2010. And Barroso has done it probably 10 times. And his latest incarnation was for a European industrial renaissance. Now that all sounds very great, but that's not going to overcome, that's not going to create a narrative that is going to convince people. So in that sense, we do need to emphasize what Europe is good at, and we do need to be much more clear about where we can have success without getting back into the discussion of this morning, the discussion about losing autonomy, sovereignty, we are not the United States of Europe, without getting in that type of discussion. So there's a fine line. There's a fine line to follow. So let me just in a few minutes emphasize one thing. Let's focus on this credibility of institutions that we need, and let's look at Europe where we have succeeded in having that success in terms of institutions. Now, if you look at that, then the first that basically comes to my mind is competition policy. European competition policy has an enormous institutional credibility. The Commissioner for Competition, basically that office has enormous credibility. And what did it depend on? Obviously, it depended on the fact that competition policy was not on the national agenda, so there was an empty area for competition policy at the European level. It depended on having leaders, commissioners, that have been very credible in that role. And by having that combination about a space to enter that was open and having credible leaders, there has been an institution, a competition authority at the European level, if you want to call it like that, that is highly credible. So that's one. You can also say competition policy might be, but we may disagree on everything what I say, that competition policy might be a well-defined task. So maybe that helps too, is a well-defined task. Okay, that's the first example, competition policy. Let's come with the second example. The second example has indeed to do with the financial sector. It was impossible to build credibility at the European level for anything that looked like banking supervision or banking authority. It was impossible till the crisis. So we did manage to introduce the European passport. We did manage to free up intra-European capital movements. So we did manage to do that, but we didn't provide the micro foundation to make that stable. And we have learned in the crisis that we need to put some tools in place, some plumbing in place in order to make that credible. But we needed a crisis to make the people in general think that Europe could be credible in doing that, and that would not be at the expense, it is, but it would not be at the expense of national sovereignty. And that applies to the banking union. The banking union idea would never have come up in the way it came up without a crisis. It would have been impossible. La Rochère was the La Rochère committee came up in 2008 at the beginning of the crisis. And at that point, it was still impossible to put real power at the European level with respect to bank supervision, despite all the examples where European banks cross-border were basically not being supervised, and there were in the resolution all kinds of cross-border conflicts. And actually, it's nice I sit next to André. The Dutch and the Belgians managed to fully fail in their supervision and resolving banking crises, because many of our financial institutions are cross-border, Belgium and the Netherlands. Think about Fortis, think about ING, there are quite a few. The Dutch and the Belgian authorities at some point didn't even talk to each other anymore, and that was in the middle of the crisis. La Rochère in 2008 could not solve that, but at that point he could only create the authorities, like the European Banking Authority, with coordination powers. But fortunately, between parentheses, the crisis deepened, and we got possibilities to deepen basically the consolidation of power at the European level, and that's the whole idea of behind the banking union. I already made a few comments on it with respect to whether it will be effective, etc. So we have to be careful about how we are going about the banking union. But there is public support for the banking union. There is public support for the banking union, which is a good thing. The third example is probably the one that we have talked about a little already, and I think it's the really big success story of the European Union. We're talking about the internal market. And again, the question is this a well-defined task, completing the internal market? Probably the answer is no, but the whole way of the European Union coming together, it was obvious that cross-border frictions had to be resolved. And so in that sense, it was well-defined, and where it is more difficult, it is where it impinges more on national policies. Think about labor services, tax-based harmonization, etc. But there is broad public support for the internal market, and I think there is an institutional credibility at the European level for the internal market. So now the question is, given all this, where is institutional credibility for anything that looks like industrial policy, even in the more narrow, in the sense that I have been describing in the beginning? Here we have to be very careful, because institutional credibility is crucial. Running ahead of institutional credibility will be dangerous. Simultaneously, it's a chicken and egg problem. If you don't, how can you get credibility if you never start? Yeah. So industrial policy, we have to be very careful in what we mean by it. I have given a very narrow definition of industrial policy, but even in my narrow definition of improving the dialogue between business and government, and trying to fine-tune potential measures in order to not unnecessarily hinder economic growth, that information that's being gained by the government via the private sector. That's a very narrow definition of industrial policy. At the European level, you have to ask the question whether this will lead to the general idea of capture of the European Union by big industry. And that capture would immediately pose a backlash to any idea of industrial policy. While there clearly is scope for industrial policy beyond just having a dialogue. And what is the scope for industrial policy? The primary scope are network investment, cross-border network investments. That's the primary scope. If you look at Europe, if you look at the energy network, there is a real need of solving the cross-border network investment problem. And I presume all people may know much more about this. There is a real scope for some harmonization of the corporate tax base. So there are clearly reasons to put, if you put this below the label of industrial policy, to give it a European face. So the question is how to get it in a way that we create credible institutions, how to get it in a way that we are not running ahead of ourselves and posing a backlash towards the European Union and the whole European idea. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Arnoud. Going to go straight to Sean.
Okay, thank you. So the question that we were posed has to do with the role of the state, and in particular I was asked to talk about, as Arnoud was, industrial policy, investment policy, and industrial relations, and by extension, employment policy. There's a long-standing argument about whether there is a distinctly European, quote-unquote, variety of capitalism, which stands in contrast to the Anglo-American model. The European model can be reduced quite simply to an emphasis on long-term returns to investment versus short-term profits in the Anglo-American model. The European model is typically characterized as emphasizing quality, whereas the American model emphasizes innovation. This in turn, these two trajectories in turn are supported by a series of interlocking institutional arrangements on either side of the Atlantic, a financial system centered on banks and a strong role for the state in the European system, equity markets in the Anglo-American one, stronger involvement of the state in crafting industrial policy in the European model, an industrial policy which in the United States relies mainly on tax incentives and government spending. The European model has lower labor mobility with stronger welfare state protections and an education system that emphasizes specific versus general skills, as is the case in the US. And industrial relations in Europe are typically characterized broadly as corporatist with strong worker guarantees versus enterprise-based bargaining in the American model. Each of those systems is supposed to have its own strengths. In fact, each is meant, according to this argument, to underlie the unique comparative advantage of the two models. As I said before, the European model tends to emphasize quality, longer-term returns on investment, whereas the American model emphasizes, as I think Joe Stiglitz put it, the entrepreneurial model, an innovation-based model. So the crucial question that I'd like to pose is, A, whether the system that I've characterized with respect to Europe remains coherent, and second, does it continue to underlie a viable comparative advantage that is worth protecting? The question, as I see it, can be answered fairly simply, that personally, I see neither the likelihood nor, in fact, the need for that European model to radically change. It makes some sense for it to adjust. Certainly, one could talk about labor mobility in France. One could talk about the specificity of education and some other issues. But if you think about the comparative advantage of Europe and the bases, the institutional bases on which it rests, as I said, I see neither the likelihood nor the need to drastically change them. What I do see is perhaps the need to question two things. First, whether that model, as I've described it, expands or extends into the south and to the east, and whether it should, whether it needs to. Whether the south and the east on their own have a comparative advantage underlying which are a set of institutions that are consistent with its comparative advantage, whether those should be preserved, or whether those economies need to converge either towards the northern or western European model or towards some other model. And second, and I'll come back to this quite briefly just at the very end, I think what's been missing in today's conversation so far is, in part, a theory of political convergence and political, social, institutional change within the European project itself. The question is generally put, should these things change? I think that belies an underlying set of assumptions about how economic institutions change that I'd like to challenge and come back to at the end. But before I do that, I'd first like to just simply pose, what are the alternatives to this existing European model? I briefly laid out the Anglo-American one. I'll just simply retrace it for 1 second. It's a stronger emphasis on equity markets. It's labor mobility that is highly decentralized, high labor mobility and a decentralized collective bargaining system. It does have a strong industrial policy, but the nature of the industrial policy is quite different, driven by US government spending, particularly around defense, and also a tax incentive system. One thing to note is that the crisis, the economic crisis of 2007, 2008, did not significantly alter the American model. If anything, it has strengthened it. The financial sector remains very central to the functioning of the American economic system. Labor mobility has decreased somewhat, but this is largely due to the fact that people can't divest from their house and move somewhere else in the country. Collective bargaining in the public sector has now degraded to the point that it reaches the already extremely weak levels of collective bargaining in the private sector. So the American model, the entrepreneurial model, has, if anything, been strengthened coming out of the crisis. And the model, of course, does have much to recommend it. It generates powerful tendencies towards both efficiency and innovation. It's what Mr. Stiglitz referred to as an entrepreneurial economy. And it's certainly true that the US is at this point emerging more quickly from the financial crisis than is the case in Europe, which gives the American model some of the moral high ground at the moment. However, it is, of course, not without its drawbacks. The flexibility of the American economy has proven uneven. The current recovery has been driven both by cheap energy costs, the result largely of the fracking boom, and by improvements in labor and productivity that have so far not been matched by increases in labor costs. This has ballooned both wealth and income inequality, which were already at unacceptable levels before the crisis. More interesting, perhaps, it has posed an ironic problem in that it is now more economical to manufacture goods in the United States. But after decades of deregulation and deindustrialization, the US now lacks critical infrastructure and critical know-how to take advantage of what are these, these new economic conditions. So, the other major alternative that I see out there in terms of a variety of capitalism moves in precisely the opposite direction, which is to say, if you look at China or other countries in the East, what you find is the emergence of a new state-centered, far more state-centered than is the case in Western Europe, variety of capitalism. Industrial policy is tightly controlled. Industrial relations policy is tightly controlled. Investment is highly targeted towards growth industries. This approach presents a strong alternative, if not to the US and to Europe, then to countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Latin America. And one could argue to the countries of the South and the East in Europe, which face a similar growth-oriented trajectory. But in the end, neither the American model nor the state-centered Asian model poses a serious alternative for Europe. On some level, economic systems are rooted in, or at least intertwined with, values. And the values of Europe contrast with both of these alternatives. It is difficult to see Europe embracing an American or British level of social inequality, or more tolerance of economic volatility. Just as it is difficult to see Europe, at least Western Europe, embracing less democracy in exchange for faster growth. Nor would I say that that there seems to be a compelling case that such a shift is dramatically called for. The European model still generally works. There remains a market for quote-unquote high-quality European goods, and the performance of Western Europe, while lackluster, particularly in France, has been generally at least somewhat robust. The effects of the crisis in those economies have been mitigated, and in fact, in some places, certainly Germany, seem to have been quite strong. Industrial policy has been directed largely effectively, and here I would probably echo Arnoud, towards cementing Europe's position within the global supply chains within which it has comparative advantage. Harmonization of standards, communication and transportation linkages among Eurozone countries is proceeding well and it's having the intended effects, positive effects on growth. And sector-specific investments in space, in aerospace, in clean energy have been either relatively successful or uncontroversial. labor mobility within both Europe, within European countries and among European countries remains quite limited. But this is partly a feature of a quality-oriented system rather than necessarily a bug. The more difficult question, it seems to me, has to do with the so-called periphery. The economic system that I'm referring to as the European model is in fact a creature of Northern and Western Europe. The so-called South, which I would includes Ireland, and indeed the East, have integrated into the monetary and political structures of Europe, but they come, of course, from very different political, social, and economic traditions, and their growth trajectory, their comparative advantage, is quite different from that of the rest of Europe. Their growth in recent years has been led largely by inward investment, and of course, this has led to many factories and houses being built. But the social guarantees associated with the European model have come largely through guarantees of public sector employment and on a redistribution policy within the EU, not based on an integration with a viable comparative advantage. In fact, it would be difficult to discern a coherent industrial policy, particularly in the South, prior to the crisis, or perhaps better put, prior to the 1980s. And industrial relations and education systems have proven to be, that existed beforehand, have proven to be robust, which is to say, while the economic and financial integration has taken place, the industrial relations systems, the industrial policies have not converged anywhere towards the Western European model. In the midst of the crisis, they have furthermore received, I would argue, quite confusing advice from both their American and European partners about which direction to go, about what nature convergence should take. The East presents a further interesting contrast. There, arguably, there were some more elements that were in some sense closer to the Western European model. There was certainly far stronger industrial policy, probably far too strong, and integration with an industrial relations policy and the state were quite close. In the aftermath, though, of 1989, and then even more so in the context of the crisis, we've seen those institutional systems, the varieties of capitalism in the East diverging, with some countries, notably Poland, tacking to a set of institutions that closely resembles the Anglo-American model, others gravitating more towards Russia and the BRICS, associated with the Eastern Europe, the Asian model, and still others attempting to integrate within the Western European standard. This raises this question that I will just briefly touch on, which is the question of the question itself. I would respectfully take issue with the way that the question was posed today. The question was posed, should European institutions with respect to industrial policy, with respect to industrial relations, with respect to the labor market, change? This implies the idea that we, as economists, or political economists, or as politicians, can essentially try to direct the policy in one specific direction or another. I would suggest, in fact, that what this implies is a fundamental flaw within the European project, which is its theory of change, the idea that we can either set monetary policy in one direction and assume that not only will the politics, but also the institutional context of regional and national economies will adjust to the monetary policy, or that policies can be set in Brussels, which then jigsaw puzzle the rest of the EU towards some direction. Instead, I come from more of a political economy perspective, which suggests that the constellation of powerful actors, unions, political parties, corporate interests within a country will deal with the same crisis in very different ways depending on the constellation and the distribution of power within those countries. And what we've seen is that the same crisis applied to all of these different regions have reacted in very different ways based on the underlying institutional structure and associated political structure with a small p within each of these countries. If there is to be some kind of convergence, it requires us to think about that model of change. The question becomes, in a sense, was this a wasted crisis? I fear that the answer
Sean,
is yes.
I think
I'm about done. I'm done.
Wrap up done.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Without that, without that, I go back to Abraham Lincoln's statement, right? A house divided against itself cannot stand. He was referring to the slave system versus the northern industrial system. I would suggest the same would be true for Europe. A Europe with two models of growth, one based on low wages and the other based on quality, will have a difficult time standing.
Thank you very much. A lot of interesting thoughts in both of those presentations. We've got 3 people, and I think I'm going to have to ask you to be fairly pithy because we haven't got that much time left. Peter first.
Thank you. As we have to be brief, it sounds more brutal than I intend. The so-called European social model is not European, is not social, and is not a model for anybody and anyone in the world. I could explain this, but there's no time. Second, on the short term and the long term, what we see in the ITC industry today is a pretty long-term approach. This is a very US-based approach. 70% of all software in the world is still written in the US, not necessarily by Americans. So that was a very long-term shot. And that has to do with the innovation, which may be coming later. Third, globalization. Nobody in the world cares on the feeling of the Europeans as to the globalization. And whether that goes ahead or not, no one takes care. So the Europeans probably have to adopt to this, or they will sink jointly. Actually, we have to remind ourselves, globalization started sort of in the Middle East earlier on, but the real push was in 1492 when the Europeans invaded or found North America. So, and there's no way to redress this. Fourth, Europe accounts for 7% of the world population, 22% of world GDP, and 50% of social spending in the world. I will leave it to everybody to answer the question whether we think that this will be sustainable in a faster globalization in the world. We're coming to this innovation later on. Fifth, youth unemployment basically is homemade in most of our countries and will be solved only homemade. It's to a large extent a result of monopolies driven wages and the two-tier labor market in Europe. Fifth, on the reindustrialization in Europe, as usually the Commission is a late indicator. The Commission now starts to a program of reindustrialization Europe. After a couple of months earlier, they decided to launch an inquiry into the German current account surplus, which is to 70%, of course, driven by industrial products, which is 50% of all European industrial exports is from Germany. So if you have a large industry, you have to have large exports for the simple reason that most home markets are much too small, but Europe has lost on this substantially over the last couple of years. There are 5 countries in Europe which account for 70% of the industrial value in Europe, and there are 2 or 3 countries who have even a higher industrial to GDP relationship than Germany, which in the average is about 23, is the Czech Republic and Hungary, like 27 or 28. Most of Europe have about 13%, actually like the US, so very simple and very positive. As to the globalization, there are 500 million people working on $135 a day. There's a billion industrial workers who work for about 12 or 14 US a day, and 3 billion people in agriculture who probably will come on the world labor market from 500 million, serving the global market before communism fell. We now employ between 1.5 and 2 billion people working in the world, and we're going up to 4 billion. Do we believe that this will be taken unnoticed in Europe and not changed all of our models.
So Europe is doomed, or is it?
No, I'm not saying Europe is doomed. Europe has everything going for it until we understand the factors who are looking for that and influence this. And I'm more concerned in Europe with the demography and the lack of skilled labor than with having affluent of skilled labor in the future to come. But the problem is that the educational system, and part of that we're talking about, is not up to that. So why do we have, even in a country like Germany, 1/6 of the people who leave elementary school without any degree? So we are producing an army of unskilled workers who have no chance in the world to compete. And my last remark on the industrialization thing is, I don't think there is a policy you can start in the European level for that. 70 or 80% of German exports is from mid-sized firms. And the so-called, what the people call this hidden champions. There is a study on hidden champions, 2,600 firms in the world with the criteria of around 100 million to 1 billion sales, market leader #1 in Europe or in the US, alternatively #1 to 3 in the world. Out of the 2,600 identified, 1,300 in Germany, 300 in Austria and Switzerland. So the majority is in the German-speaking Europe. I'm sorry for that. But, and this is no policy on the European level which we influence that. We're talking about a policy which is a bottom-up thing, and it may take 50 years or more to install something like this. So I'm afraid Europe is not doomed, but Europe will be doomed if we think there will be an answer on a European level, unless we give the freedom to entrepreneurs to start more business, and because this is the real lacking in Europe, that about only 1/3 of the number of startups in the US compared to Europe is in relation to GDP. And we may go in later in some others on the financing of innovation, and that is the real problem in Europe, is not bank loans, is the equity financing of innovation is the real lagging. And if we don't solve that, then the European industry or European economy will be doomed in a way that Europe maybe not then be the best place to make money, but it's certainly the best place in the world to spend money.
Thank you. Philippe, and then David.
Two quick points on industrial policy and productivity. I think we should remember there's lots and lots of empirical work done on where does productivity growth come from. And productivity increases not because all firms increase their productivity. At the aggregate level, productivity increases because the most efficient, the most productive firms expand and the others disappear, okay? And that's, I think there are many policies in Europe which I think hinder this process, and we understand why, because socially it's a painful process. So I think one issue is labor mobility, because obviously when you're going to have this reallocation of factors of production, especially labor, from non-efficient firms to efficient firms, it also means moving from one region to another, or one firm to another. So one issue is labor mobility, and the other is also training of workers, which is a big failure, especially in France. It's an enormous problem. The second point I want to make is about economic geography and the link between economic geography and productivity. We know there's a lot of empirical work also showing that geographical concentration of activities of productive firms and manufacturing actually has a big effect on productivity. So it's all this idea of clusters. Typically what is found in the literature is if you multiply by 2 the concentration of manufacturing in a region, in an industry, you're going to increase productivity by 8% of other firms. It's a one-for-all increase, and so it's not every year that you're going to get this increase in productivity. So it's not a miracle, but it is important. Again, I think there are many policies in Europe that hinder this process of concentration. If we think of cities, the problem of congestion, labor mobility again, and training of workers. So I think these are, I want to insist on these two things, training of workers and labor mobility. And from that point of view, the right dimension, I'm not sure is Europe. The problem of labor mobility is not between countries, it's in fact inside countries. And so here it's really the problem of national structural policies.
Thank you. David?
I want to pick up Arnoud's points and point to three policies, one of which I think is successful, one is partly successful, one of which is a failure. The successful one is the state aid's approach of DG Comp, which prevents insane local industrial policies distorting activities. And I think that's a very important and successful part, at least when you look at the principles, perhaps not quite so much on the delivery. The partly successful one is we ask, what is it that Europe ought to be aiming at? And it's to deal with public goods that are relevant at the European level, if you like, the cross-border spillovers. Now, the Renewables Directive is quite good at that because it says there are important spillovers in driving down the costs of low-carbon technologies, renewable technologies. The problem is they're non-commercial, so we need a funding mechanism. And we have solved the club good problem by devolving to each member state a requirement to deliver a certain proportion of renewables. I say it's partly successful because we haven't done that at least cost. We can't trade them across borders. The failure is the one thing that I think is really important, and that is the research and development in low carbon technologies. We have a strategic energy technology plan with no mechanism to fund it, just an aspiration. You could combine the Renewables Directive Club Good mechanism with that and deliver something that would actually solve, I think, a very important missing market.
Thank you. I'm going to draw it to a conclusion now because we need to move on to lunch and Joe Stiglitz, at least one of which will be welcome to everybody. I wouldn't like to sum up, and indeed I think there was only one point made that I saw almost unanimous support for, and that was when Peter said that Europe's big mistake was in 1492 when it discovered America.
I didn't say it's a mistake.
Which I thought was slightly ungenerous in an event sponsored by Colombia. But
besides, can I just say, besides, the Indians in America didn't know that they were lost.
Yes.
Exactly.
Notice that Colombia's coming back now.
Yes, but this is typical German, bluntness, telling it how it is. Thank you for your contributions, and I hand back to Jan.
So we.